Every time he gets literally a 5-second outage, it drops all the automation and he has to reset the whole production line, which for him was actually means anything through that production line at the time is completely wasted. And you're looking at $50,000 of bags that are just useless.
When we talk about modernizing the electric grid, much of the focus tends to be on technology, DERs, AI, real-time data, and microgrids. But what if one of the most transformative shifts utilities must make isn't technological at all? What if it's how we define success? For decades, utility performance has been guided primarily by regulatory compliance, meeting targets set by commissions, staying within cost recovery bounds, and avoiding outages. But today's leading utilities are flipping that model on its head. They're recognizing that regulatory may set the floor, but it's the expectation of customers and communities that define the ceiling. Joining us today are two guests who are right in the thick of that transformation. First, Guy Chalkley, CEO of Endeavour Energy, one of Australia's fastest evolving grid operators. And second, Richard McIndoe, Executive Chairman and CEO of Edge Zero, whose work is helping push utilities like Endeavour Energy toward a more customer-centric, agile operating model. Together, they're helping us reframe how success is measured in the energy transition and why the lessons unfolding in Australia may be a postcard from the future for North American utilities. I'm Jason Price, coming to you from New York City, and joining me as always from Orlando, Florida, is Matt Chester, podcast producer and community manager. So Matt, you had the opportunity to meet with Guy and Richard recently at DistribuTech. What about that conversation caught your ear that will be key towards today's episode being a must-listen for our audience?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And you're right. I got a bit of a sneak peek when I met Guy and Richard, along with some additional Australian utility executives, for a great sit-down conversation at the Springs DistribuTech. And I'll definitely include in the show notes of this episode the article that came from that talk. But I came away from it knowing that we had only just begun to scratch the surface with Guy and Richard. And the theme I really heard was how Australia's grid, it really was a few steps ahead of us here in the United States, as the great economics and adoption of solar forced the grid operators to adopt earlier and faster to these increased DERs across their service areas. And that trial by far, it allowed them to gather some great perspectives that I think U.S. leaders would be wise to adopt before they're needed. Areas like you mentioned, the customer-focused metrics, how to leave old thinking about the grid behind, and the types of unexpected challenges and opportunities that arise in such a period of rapid changes. So I'm eager to dive into these topics even deeper with Richard and Guy today.
Yeah, as am I. So let's do that. So a big thank you to Edge Zero, our sponsor of today's episode. Now let's get started. Guy and Richard, welcome to Power Perspectives.
Hi.
Hello.
Good to be here.
Well, thrilled to have you. So how about this? So Guy, let's start with you. You previously mentioned that in recent years, the KPIs for Endeavour Energy had shifted from regulatory focus to being centered around the customer today. That's a significant cultural pivot for utility. Tell us a little bit about your background and then walk us through the shift and give us some examples of key KPIs on your dashboards today.
Yeah, I mean, from a background perspective, I've probably worked across a lot of countries and a lot of different sectors. So I've only really done a decade in energy, and all in Australia. Done a lot of utilities. I've done a lot of water utilities. I've done sort of large scale airport construction, and I actually started sort of in a commodity broking firm sort of in the 90s. So you sort of got a lot of diversity, I suppose, across countries and sectors. We sat down with the investors 5 years ago, and the board members, and said, sort of, what do you want at the next 5 years? And you could see that the transition was certainly picking up at pace from an energy sector. And whilst we were a regulated business, we said, you have got to focus on a customer. You're a sort of privileged monopoly regulated business, but to be successful in the future, you're really going to make sure that customer is happy with pretty much a consistent sort of performance, across everything you do. And we said, what does that make success look like? So we've got regulatory targets, but I would class them as sort of performance indicators. They're sort of maybe the tier below what are the key performance indicators. And we just said, look, if you can get customer satisfaction and reputation right, if you can get employee engagement right, and if you can get your safety right, the dollars sort of fall out naturally. And more importantly, they fall out sustainably. So it's that old adage, you can always do a 1 year hit on dollars, but you probably won't have a sustainable foundation to make it lasting and enduring. And so we've just kept with them. So yeah, our indicators really revolve around, customer, but really sort of sitting around that is sort of employee safety stakeholder. If you get all them right, funny enough, the dollars seem to come out okay. And it seems to have kept the investors happy with the sort of pace that it's moving at.
All right, fantastic. So Richard, you're hearing Guy's description of, the transformation that he's going through. Help us understand, your role and your team's role, team being Edge Zero, in helping support, Guy's work and basically supporting utilities to make this shift that he's describing.
Yeah, so my background is very much in the utility space, both up in Asia and here in Australia, where I was previously running Energy Australia, which had about 3 million customers across the eastern seaboard of Australia. What we found was that increasingly through the energy transition, customers were changing their habits, their usage. They were adopting new technologies like solar much faster than the regulators and the industry had expected them to do. Here in Australia, we've had this rapid growth in rooftop solar. Now, 38% of households have got solar panels on their roof. So what you're seeing is changes being driven by the customer. It's no longer being driven by the regulators as much as, and it's no longer being driven by building new generation transmission only. It's being driven by changing customer habits. What we seek to do at Edge is provide greater visibility of what those customers are doing, greater visibility of the impact of those customer changes and new technologies on the traditional networks, and provide that visibility to customers like Guy so that they've got the data and they've got the experience to make the necessary changes to keep serving their customers going forward. So it's really about giving real-time visibility and data on what customers are doing, and enabling, therefore, companies like Guy's to change their or to adapt to that going forward.
In the lead up, you mentioned a terminology that's we're familiar with in North America, and that's regulatory inertia. So let me ask my question and love to hear your thoughts on it. And Guy, be gentle with the response that Richard may come back with. He doesn't mean it personally here. So we hear regularly that these days, too many utilities are focused on managing what went wrong yesterday rather than changing the business model to be more proactive and, anticipate challenges of tomorrow. So, Richard, how do you advise utilities to make that mindset shift? And to your earlier, the earlier comment, how do you avoid the trap of regulatory inertia?
Yeah. So regulatory inertia is endemic across our industry, and we work in 5-year cycles here in Australia and similarly in the UK as well. So the thinking across the industry is in 5-year cycles. And it's always been like that because people haven't really changed much over the last 100 years, maybe a little bit more usage, but generally it was pretty stable the way people use power. Over the last 10 years, we've seen a complete flip of that. We've seen the customers adopting new technologies. We're seeing not just new technologies such as solar and battery and EV at the customer level, overall customer usage habits changing significantly. And I don't think that the regulatory systems have actually caught up with the fact that new technologies can happen very, very quickly. It surprises me still that the regulators work on these 5-year cycles, which for someone like Guy will probably take him an additional 2 to 3 years to prepare for that with his planning system. So you're trying to forecast what's going to happen in 8 years' time in your regulatory submission. And 8 years is a heck of a long time in terms of technology changes and customer adoption. And we've seen that here in Australia.
All right, Guy, any comments or feedback on what Richard's experience has been like, and how have you, viewed this at Endeavour?
I think Richard has been quite kind there, actually. I think regulation by its nature is going to be, it's applying rules that are set in the past for something that is going to happen in the future. And I think, as Richard said, that's okay when life is quite static and doesn't change much, but, something that has rapidly changed. And so, you have got to adapt. And it's not just a 5-year reg cycle. You're also possibly in a 3-year federal government cycle, a 4-year state government cycle. There's lots of things that are very short term in nature for what is a long term solution. How do you actually change that? I think you've got to start looking forward, to mid-30s to see what are you actually trying to achieve, and then work backwards rather than incrementally moving forward. Because I think what we've seen is if you incrementally move forward, you're probably always going to apply the old solutions. Whereas if you can be braver and look forward, accept that you're probably going to make some mistakes because you're not going to be completely accurate on where 2035 will land you, but probably more accurate than maybe just incrementally getting there. And so that's what we tried to do. We tried to say, like, what does the world look like in 2035 and work backwards, and then push that into what does that mean for, the next 5 years in getting that right. And that does put customer first. We said traditionally, the solution was, so how people used power. I think we've got to get around the fact that it's people are choosing how to use power. It's not just our solution now. It's their solution as well. So the whole world is, literally sort of span 180 degrees. And so, you've probably got to spin your thinking 180 degrees as well. And it does get a different outcome. It might require less investment capital wise in certain areas, and it might require more investment in, getting a solution that gives you a good data insight to make good decisions. There's spins where you're going to spend your money.
One thing I might also add to that, Jason, I talked about customer adoption being a lot faster now. There's a really interesting photos that do the rounds. Tony Seba originally came up with these 2 black and white photos from New York in 1900 and New York in 1913. And it showed the change over that 13-year period from 100% horse and carts to 100% motor vehicles. Now, I looked at this, I did some research into it, and actually, he's wrong, I'm afraid. It didn't happen in 13 years. It actually happened in 5 years. The first Model T Ford rolled off the production line in October 1908. So in the space of 5 years, every vehicle or every form of transport in New York moved from horse-drawn to motor vehicle. And we're still working in 2025 on these 5-year cycles that regulators are still thinking it's going to be the same thing over the next 5 years. We just don't have the regulators haven't caught up with the fact that the customer is going to drive this change. And that's a major issue across all of the economies that we deal with.
Yeah. And don't forget, being a New Yorker, you can never find a place to park. So, I understand that first.
At least you don't have all the roads full of horse manure as they were back in 1900 now. They've got other forms of pollution, but at least
this is true. There are other smells that make up for that. But okay. On that note, let's continue with our question. I have a question, and it goes back to the opening where we talked about, regulatory standards serving as ceiling rather than the floor. And you've seen that in North America. You have, in some respects, have flipped that, where it's the floor rather than the ceiling. So we're a little left to hear you unpack this balance of meeting regulatory compliance while aiming for a higher standard that aligns more with customers of tomorrow. So knowing that you've got this audience of North American leaders who are listening in, how do you approach it? How have you been successful at this? I'd love to hear your thoughts around that.
So I think it's a balance. I mean, you're trying to get a good regulatory outcome as a company, but you've got to be much more proactive on what your customer is looking for as well, and also what they're doing. A good example that's come up pretty recently for us, if I take a particularly large industrial customer, we've got 2, I would say, reg performance indicators. One is effectively, the time of the duration, and one's the frequency of the duration. And if we meet those, then we're really good with our customer. And then we literally had a large industrial customer saying, like, "You're pretty rubbish, Guy. Like, literally, I'm really struggling." It was a large healthcare company that basically makes saline bags for hospitals. And we said, "Well, I don't understand what your problem is. Like you don't have that many outages, and they're not that, they're not for that long." And then what he actually said was, no, he said, "We get lots and lots of dropouts that are 1 to 2 seconds." And we weren't even picking it up because we weren't even monitoring it. And what we didn't realize, his whole, factory had been automated in the last few years. So it's completely robotic. And so every time he gets literally a 5-second outage, it drops all the automation, and he has to reset the whole production line, which for him actually means anything through that production line at the time is completely wasted. And, you're looking at, $50,000 of bags that are just useless. But we didn't even know until he told us, and we weren't even monitoring it because it wasn't one of our indicators that the regulator has set us. But so I think the customer, the world's changed, the customer's changed. We just got to be more proactive to understand what they're doing and what they need and be at the front end of the process, not the back end of the process. So we shouldn't just be the person that connects, them right at the end or gives them power right at the end. We need to be with them at the start of their journey as they're expanding, as they're changing. So we understand what we need to deliver to give a good customer outcome. And I say there are lots of examples like that where the world has changed, but our indicators don't pick it up. Yeah, we thought we gave them a brilliant service. It's interesting as you play it out.
Richard, anything to add to that?
I 100% agree. Guy is very enlightened about his approach there, but I can tell you the majority of utilities hide behind SAIDI and SAIFI because they say we're regulatory compliant and they know that the quality of power that they're delivering is inadequate and insufficient for the needs of their customers. So we work with data center providers looking at the power quality there. It's not just about we want to have 24/7 power. They want to have clean power. We work with Caterpillar globally around providing that clean power quality monitoring for their oil and gas mining customers as well. The customer needs to have really clean quality of and top quality power there. And the regulatory framework and the SAIDI and SAIFI measures are not catching that. And to be brutally honest, a lot of utilities are thinking, well, let's just keep it this way because we can hide behind that. And I prefer not to see the problem. Let's just sweep it under the carpet. The regulators need to get on top of this and they need to get on top of it really quickly.
I'm really loving the storytelling here. So Guy, let's go back to you, whether it's that example or another example where, the metrics, I guess, are being too narrowly defined and customers are falling outside of that and your awareness is just not there. So I would love to hear what are some of those metrics that you're now instituting that are, overcome some of the major challenges that some of your customers are facing. Or do you have any examples and how do you measure them? And just, I'd love to just hear some thoughts around that.
I mean, it's interesting because before I get to the metrics, it's sort of it's a people and culture business, like any other industry you've ever worked in. And so a lot of it is allowing people to, to be more challenging, to be more inquisitive. It's a cultural shift that they are allowed to sort of challenge the process or the governance or the procedure or the standard, rather than just sort of sit back and be reactive to when a problem happens. So you'd rather be proactive, that you're actually getting insight that hopefully stops the problem before it happens. That's the shift. And then you drive KPIs and performance out of that. But there are lots of perverse things that sit within a regulatory framework. Like if I bounce really quickly, we haven't got a category at the moment when we do a reg submission for storage. Well, it's pretty obvious how many batteries you probably need in your network, but we've got one called pole replacement. We've got categories that have always been there, but people have got to put batteries into their network. They need some sort of storage, through what's gone on in the distribution network, but we're not there yet. So again, challenge it, push it, be pretty vocal in terms of, we're not saying it's wrong the way it was, but it's not fit for the purpose that it needs going forward. And so you're sort of trying to agitate and lobby to get where you need to get to. I'd give an example. We sold our head office 3 years ago. But one of the challenges we had with the investors is they say, well, why are you selling it, Guy? I get a return on it. And I go, but I've got nobody in there at the moment. It's like COVID's hit, like it's like a ghost town. So it's just this massive footprint that, is sitting there doing nothing. So the cultural piece that you could achieve by moving people into a smaller purpose-built office surely outweighs the regulatory return you would have got on having a property that sits there doing nothing, sort of thing. But you've got to have those fights to change the way people traditionally think. And funnily enough, you might lose a bit on the return. You gain fourfold on being able to change the culture to move into an open plan office that hasn't got, offices for senior people. And, you can change to the way the world is today, not the way the world was yesterday. So there's lots of things you can always, I think, challenge and keep moving it forward, but keep remembering that the customer's there, really. That's the one that you're really there for. And I think if you do that, you'll probably find a good solution that works for your investor as well. So we seem to have got there, but we still got a lot of work to go.
Richard, I'd like to go back to you and ask you about, some of the, your Edge Zero technology, particularly as it relates to some of the quality of power flow and such that both you and Guy raised. So, phase imbalance or reverse power flow are invisible issues, but they're issues that can be measured. How is Edge Zero approaching that? Can you talk about this?
Yeah, so we monitor at a transformer level, not just the performance and health of the transformer, but the power quality passing over that transformer. The reason we do that is that that's that last constraint point before the customer. You don't get the level of power quality monitoring at a smart customer, smart meter level, and you don't need it actually. The point of constraint from the network's perspective is that transformer that serves anywhere between 5, 10 up to 50, 60 customers. So we monitor there because that's representative of the major constraint points. We monitor power quality across voltage, frequency, harmonics, flicker, and fault. So it's a sub-second monitoring. You can take that data back and you can look at it at a sub-second level, at a 1 minute, 5 minute, 15-minute level, according to how your engineers want to look at it. But what it will do is it will detect if there is an issue, if there's a safety issue, a fault issue, you can get an alert there immediately to tell you this is a problem. Now, why is that important for a network company? Well, rather than waiting for your call center to get inundated by calls from people, well, you can see proactively where the problem is and you can address that in a more cost-effective way. So everything does come down to economics at the end of the day, and we're giving you real-time visibility so you can make your decisions about when you want to send the teams out, when you want to fix it. We'll also give you the real visibility on voltage and phase balance, and that will enable you to go out and fix those voltage issues and those phase balance issues. Why is that good from a regulatory point of view? Well, from a regulatory point of view, if you're running high voltages or phase imbalance there, it's your consumers are going to be using more power. It's inefficient to do that. You want to have stable voltages and balanced phases, and that's, from a pure economics point of view, that's a big driver of the MPV of the program. The other big driver is that rather than having crews going out there to try and search for the problem, when you've got a customer complaint, you're actually seeing in real time where the problem is. It's Google Maps for electricity. We see the power flows, we see the congestion, we see the problems on your GIS system in real time, and you can respond to that accordingly.
All right, very nice. So I want to go back to the conversation we had back at DistribuTech. You and others from the Australian contingent felt pretty confident that you're good 5 to 10 years ahead of the U.S. when it comes to DER penetration. I think that might be a bit of a bold statement, but it can only be that way if you have everything aligned and in sync. And I feel like what I'm hearing from both of you, that Australia is there. You already have that stability, that wherewithal, that awareness, and that customer relationship, which is great. And so now I'm thinking that you're probably right. You are that further ahead than the United States in DER penetration. So knowing that we've got a utility audience listening in, I'd love to hear from both of you. When it comes to, lessons to learn, what are some of those lessons that the U.S. can, really be thinking about in terms of how to address and maybe even catch up to you in terms of the success that you've been experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, importantly, we're not there yet. I think we're in front, but we're definitely not there yet. And I think we've had to react just because of the speed that has happened in our sort of networks, in terms of the take up of rooftop solar, as a first point. And we'll see it again with a take up of batteries as well. And so we're not there yet, but I think we've got a great opportunity to make it work. Some of it is out of therefore necessity because it's happened, and therefore, we're trying to put solutions in that do make it work. Because I've said before, I think the worst thing you could ever do is to tell a customer that they can't have rooftop solar because, the rest of the street's already got it and you're too late. So we've got to make our network robust enough to, ensure that we can partner with that customer to make sure they have the solutions that they want, not just the one that we're going to force feed them, which is probably what it was in the past. I think our learning that, that we're now picking up quickly is Richard's data point. We come from an industry that, has been asset obsessed. It's built really good asset solutions that have worked, historically for us. But that probably didn't make us customer obsessed. And it certainly didn't make us data obsessed. And so whilst we've got just an enormous amount of data internally, generally it lags. It's not real time. It doesn't give good insights. And it's only there to tell you when you can fix something. And so the bit that we've probably got to really move at pace with, and the technology, with the likes of Richard and Edge is available, is we've got to manage to orchestrate all that data that now sits in our network. We've got to be able to have visibility of it in a real time basis so that we can make good, investment decisions for the customer for the future. But we've got to be able to use that insight that the data provides. And so, if I look at where our investment is now, a lot of it is in that, not just the shiny metal asset, but it's actually the magic that sits inside the asset that provides the data. That's the bit that really will make it work. So, I think I can't really comment if we're that far in front of the States because I don't reside there. But I know from our perspective, we've moved this distribution network, a long way from where it was 5 years ago.
Well, you've triggered another thought, and you're reading some of my notes because I have a question here that follows that, and it's really around the asset management, the traditional asset management of the utility. So, Guy, this question is for you. How important is this internal friction in achieving the transformation that you're describing, and what advice would you give other executives in managing that constructively to be thinking about a future grid against the traditional thinking of the current grid?
Tension in an organization between, functions, I've always found a very good thing, if you do it respectfully and you're open, and when you do it, and I think you need it. Too often we sort of don't have that conversation, that probably therefore doesn't get the optimum solution for a customer. So I think tension is really good. I made a conscious call that, I created a function called Future Grid that was not the traditional, asset planning, asset management, to create a bit of tension, because every solution that I was getting was a backward solution. And it always discounted the solution at the time that was either innovative or had a battery in it because it was more expensive. And they said, so it doesn't fit the reg model that was looking for, the most cost effective one. And so we said, well, then you're never going to get a battery in your network then, are you? Because that'll always win. But sometimes it's not the fact that if you've got if there's a solution and there's three solutions to make that work, I was finding 2 solutions were old and 1 solution was new. And then they would go, one solution's 10 million, 1 solution's 15, and 1's 17. And the most expensive was the innovative one. And I said, actually, the delta isn't as much as you think. And so perhaps I'm prepared to take a risk on the delta because it's not that much more than the traditional solution. So we started to move it that way. And we've now gone sort of full circle where we've re-merged Future Grid and traditional asset. But now it's led by the future, not led by the past. So it's got to a level of maturity that the people in that in those functions are actually probably the bigger empowerment is the ones who think forward, not the ones who think traditional. But you still need traditional. You still need someone to be your conscious. You still need that challenge. But you got to make sure that it's not always the only solution that's going to apply, because you'll never get innovation through your business if you do it that way.
Can I just bring this to a particular point now? We've just had a federal election in Australia this last weekend, and the Labor government was returned. Their core energy policy, and the most attractive part of this, is they've launched a $2.5 billion subsidy for residential batteries. That's about 650,000 homes they're going to be subsidizing to the tune of $4,000, which is about a third of the install cost. A battery in your home. And that starts on the 1st of July. So go back to that original point we were talking about. Hey, we work in an industry that's 5-year cycles and so on. Well, that's just thrown on its head. Between beginning of this year and the 1st of July, so within 6 months, actually it's about 4 months, Guy and his team are going to have to figure out how they're going to accommodate what will be not 650,000 batteries in their area, but Guy runs half of Sydney and south of New South Wales. So there's going to be a lot of batteries going into his area, and undoubtedly the state government is going to be jumping on the bandwagon of what has been really popular with the voters. And future grid for Guy is becoming tomorrow's grid, actually today's grid. So it's not just a thought about, let's have some brainstorming about what might happen. Future grid is happening today. And these kind of changes, which are significant changes, you need to have a culture within your organization that can accommodate those changes. And you need to support that culture with the information and data that they need to make the decisions, because it's actually happening today. You can't carry on kicking the can down the road. What I see with our business, because we supply utilities, we provide technology to utilities in Australia, in the UK and Europe and the US, as well as a lot of developing markets, but certainly in the US has not actually, the culture there is not about looking at what could happen actually here and now. There's always a future group. There's always a Derns group. They're a bit of a cottage industry at the moment, because actually culturally, a lot of the utilities in the US are still just wanting to continue with that asset intensive model that they've already had. They like the comfortable status quo. They haven't actually culturally realized that they're going to have to accelerate how they make these decisions for the future grid, because it's not about tomorrow, it's about happening today.
So what I'm hearing, Guy, and you're probably selling yourself a little short here, because I think that given, something like this big change come July 1st, you have the foundation, you have the silos broken, you run a future utility company, as opposed to, and I can only judge here in North America, they're very siloed. The left hand is often not talking to the right hand, and the rules are still changing, so that, people in regulatory are still trying to figure out how to, get a business case through with all the input of all the constituents that they never had to consult with, customer and affordability, and just the rules have changed. It's not just like, say, an engineer just signing off on something and getting the regulator to approve it, which was often the case in the past. So what I'm getting at is, and I feel like, this is really a question for you, Richard, if my assumptions are right, that it's a much more organized and uniform utility, more mature, what Guy is leading, then, something like an Edge Zero technology is really beneficial, because you're basically unifying all the components that are necessary to make sure that customers talking engineering, that field service is talking to the customer group. They're all much more aligned. So is that accurate? Is that an accurate way to describe why you probably can handle come July 1st? And can you maybe just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think Guy's point about silos, and everybody, organizations have silos, and utilities are notorious for having these different silos, both from a functionality capability and also from a geographic. And what you've got to, in order to link those people up and communicate and get that proactive communication and solving the issues, they've got to have a common base, and the common base is the data. If you can put the data in front of an engineering group, they will go to the data. It's not about trying to sell them something. If the hard facts are there, they will work on that, and they love working with that. And so that's why having that real-time visibility and the data on what the performance is, you can then run various different models there. But if you haven't got the data, you're just running on what we did yesterday, and we're going to try and continue to do it tomorrow. If you haven't got that real-time data about what is the impact on the power flows, where's the reverse power flows, what are the power quality issues, where have I got my constraints, where have I got my faults, where have I got those flicker issues that are causing my hospital and my data center so many problems, but they're not captured by my age-old regulatory SAIDI and safety. If you haven't got that data, you can't plan for the future. And so you just need that. It's all about the data. It's not about the assets. It's about the data.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so gentlemen, we're going to give you the final word, but at this point in the show, we're going to take a pivot to get to learn a little bit more about you, the person, rather than you, the professional. I'm going to throw a bunch of questions at you. Keep your response to one word or phrase. I'll start with you, Guy, and then Richard, you'll follow. So, Guy, are you ready?
Is that it?
Question number one. What is a hobby you wish you had more time for?
If I'll go first. I was useless at school, apart from I worked out I could draw. And it's always good being able to draw because you haven't got to revise for it, but I would love more time to be able to draw.
I travel a lot. I would really love more time to live internationally rather than just work internationally.
Guy and Richard, you're both coming to us from Australia on the other side of the world. If one of our listeners were to make a trip out to your hometown, what is a one must-see that you would recommend?
Mine, you got to get the ferry that goes under the harbour bridge, and then you'll see the Opera House for the first time as it comes into Circular Quay. I think everybody around the world has got it as iconic. You've got to do it from a ferry.
Melbourne is the sports capital of the Southern Hemisphere, and I would say anyone who can't, you have the choice of going to the Australian Tennis Open. You've got the choice of going to the cricket, the football. I would say go to the Melbourne Cricket Ground for a full house, 100,000 spectators watching Australia play England in the cricket Ashes, and you'll see what really a real crowd experience is like.
Wasn't you going to say to watch England beat Australia in a full house,
Yes.
Richard?
I think historically it has happened. Yes, it's true.
Very nice. All right, staying with the Guy and then Richard, what's your favorite part of your job?
I think the best thing about being a CEO is that you sort of don't do tasks because other people do tasks and they do it incredibly well with much more skill than you've got. But you therefore get to meet lots of people, and you can actually talk to them and listen to them. And so, yeah, I think the ability for a CEO to realize how much time they've actually got to engage with people is phenomenal.
The favorite part of what I do at Edge Zero is that we've developed a technology solution that is very applicable in countries like Australia, the UK, and the US. But we're also putting into countries like Brazil, Vietnam, Philippines, and developing markets. And that's really exciting.
All right, fantastic. So we're collecting lightning round questions from past podcast guests to ask future guests. So we recently chatted with Gautam Jain from Columbia University, who asked the following question. Do you think there's a major innovation that could come along to help us solve the climate crisis more effectively than we're currently in?
It's actually a very good question, and I'm not sort of bright enough to answer it to say what it is, but I think without a doubt, if you look 10 years forward and look what's happened in the last 5, there is something else that's going to really happen. I think data will be the enabler of it. My only other one is I don't think hydrogen is going to be the one that actually gets us out of the troubles that we might be in, but there will be something that comes out, and I think data will be the link that gives us it.
Okay, I'm going to put this in 2 categories. First of all, I'm going to talk about the frustrating but easy thing that could be done straight away, and that is all around building codes and technologies where there is an enormous amount of frustration that we talk about this stuff, but nothing happens there. So I'd say that's an easy one. But as far as science and technology is concerned, I think there's 2 areas really exciting. One, we saw Oxford University had developed last year a solar technology and nanotechnology there, which is effectively like wrapping a building in cling film, and it's got an efficiency level there that is good and a cost level that is really low. So I think that is going to be a really interesting one. I think just a little bit of left field, I think the biotechnology around absorption of CO2 is an area that's really exciting, whether it's through an algae or different biotechnologies there. But we're not going to stop people producing CO2. We've got to figure out ways to absorb it better into the ecosystem.
All right, so now we're going to turn the table over to you, where you can ask a future guest a question. And of course, the question could be topical and energy related, or it could also be off the wall.
I mean, I always love the people ones because I sort of remember stories and, remember what other people did. So, and hindsight's a wonderful thing. So mine's always, what's the biggest mistake that you made? What did you learn from it, and what would you do differently next time?
I just was reminded by, it was a quote, that the wars of the next 100 years are going to be fought over water. That came out of the UN a few decades ago. And my question is, do we think it's going to be fought over water, or the wars are going to be fought over climate change issues?
All right, those are heavy questions. All right, then lastly, and we ask this from all our guests, so Guy, starting with you, what are you most motivated by?
I mean, I think my motivations have changed. Like maybe lots of us do as we get older. I'm 60 next month, or next few months. And so for me, you sort of really say what's the next 5 years going to do, and what can you actually, achieve. So I think there's a bit of a legacy piece, knowing what's going on in the energy sector, that, you want to really hand it over, to somebody else in a much better state than what it is at the moment. And really it motivates you that you can give it to the next generation, maybe better than we received it.
Similar theme, actually. We're fortunate, Guy and I, fortunate enough to live in the lucky country. We are part of the lucky generation. We've seen amazing economic boom and a great deal of social mobility opportunities over our lifetime, which I think we probably both benefited from. My motivation is that I feel we're leaving a huge debt burden and a huge climate crisis to the next generation, and the more that we can do about mitigating that, the better.
All right, gentlemen, I did say you would get the final word, so I'd love to hear from both of you on these closing thoughts. All right, so let's look ahead. Say 5 years. What metrics do you believe utilities should be measured by beyond reliability or cost? And what does success in the energy transition really look like in a world where communities expect more from their grid than just keeping the lights on?
Yeah, probably close the loop from the start of the podcast. I mean, I think, the metrics really, is the community, and is the stakeholder, and is the customer happy with you when you ask that question in 5 years' time? And that's pretty simple. Put them first and ask them, are they happy with the service that you provided them and the direction that you've given?
I would say that in the next 5 years, I agree with Guy's point there. I think in 5 years' time, the utility sector needs to be judged on how well they have positioned their brand and achieved against their brand. I think our brand has deteriorated. It was never that high, but actually, I look back and think, it used to be seen as a solid and reliable area. It's been through a lot of controversy at the moment. I think that as an industry, we need to look at what our brand is, and that goes to more than just a return on investment for our shareholders. We need to be seen to be doing something about those issues around climate change and cost of energy. And we need to be judged on how well we've done that, and not just on what our return is to our investors.
Well, Guy and Richard, both of you present a valuable and perhaps underappreciated perspective being in the energy field in North America, and that is getting an international perspective here on how the world works and how the utility industry and the energy industry works. So I'm pretty confident that we're going to get a lot of questions and comments posted by the community, and we certainly welcome you to answer them and stay engaged with the community. So thank you both for sharing your time today. I know that it's scheduling is tough, and you're just starting your day today. So thank you again for your insights on today's episode of the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As I mentioned, you can always reach Guy and Richard through the Energy Central platform, where they welcome your questions and comments. And we also want to give a shout out of thanks to the podcast sponsors that made today's episode possible. Thanks to Edge Zero. Edge Zero provides proprietary low voltage grid monitoring hardware and cloud-based grid management solutions to enhance grid resilience and de-risk operations through the energy transition. The company serves utilities in North America, the UK, Brazil, and Southeast Asia, as well as distribution system operators in Australia, where over 7 million end customers are represented. Edge Zero technology offers real-time visibility of power flows, faults, and safety hazards across the low-voltage electricity network. Its proprietary edge-connected software equips utilities with the data analytics needed to manage distribution network assets and optimize customer solar, battery, and EV charging assets in real time within the physical constraints of the grid. And once again, I'm your host, Jason Price. Plug in and stay fully charged in the discussion by hopping into the community at energycentral.com. And we'll see you next time at the Energy Central Power Perspectives Podcast.